Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the cold waters of the North Atlantic. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe pull the blanket a little higher. And let the noise of the modern world slowly fade into the distance. The emails can wait. The dishes can wait. The messages can wait. History, fortunately, has been waiting for quite a while already. Tonight's story begins with a ship. A very famous ship. Possibly the most famous ship ever built. A ship so famous that people still talk about it more than a century later. The RMS Titanic. Now, most people know the broad outline of the story. A giant luxury liner. An iceberg. A terrible disaster. A freezing ocean. And thousands of lives changed forever. But tonight, we're not really talking about the Titanic. Not entirely. Instead, we're talking about a young boy who somehow found himself caught in not one maritime catastrophe, but two. Because apparently surviving one historic shipwreck was simply not enough excitement for a single lifetime. His name was Frank Osman. And like many remarkable historical stories, his begins in a surprisingly ordinary way. Frank was born in England during the early years of the 20th century. At the time, the British Empire stretched across enormous portions of the globe. Steamships crossed oceans carrying migrants, workers, soldiers, merchants, and dreamers. For many families, long-distance travel was becoming increasingly common. Not necessarily comfortable, but common. People packed trunks, said goodbye to relatives, boarded ships, and disappeared beyond the horizon for weeks at a time. It was a world connected by oceans. And oceans, as history repeatedly demonstrates, can be somewhat unreliable business partners. By 1912, Frank was still a young boy. Far too young to understand that he was about to become part of one of history's most famous tragedies. The Titanic had been built as a symbol of modern confidence. Actually, confidence may be too gentle a word. Arrogance might be closer. The ship was enormous, luxurious, technologically advanced, and surrounded by publicity. People admired it. Newspapers celebrated it. Investors praised it. Engineers boasted about it. Everyone seemed extremely pleased with themselves, which, historically speaking, is often when trouble begins. The Titanic departed Southampton on April 10, 1912. Passengers came from different backgrounds. Some occupied lavish first-class cabins. Others traveled in more modest accommodations. But all shared the same destination. A new life. A business opportunity. A reunion with family. Or simply a journey across the Atlantic. Among them was young Frank and his family. At the time, nobody on board knew they were sailing directly into history. The voyage itself initially seemed pleasant enough. Meals were served. Children explored corridors. Passengers socialized. Musicians performed. Stewards carried luggage. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Then came the iceberg. Now the collision itself was surprisingly subtle. Many passengers barely noticed it. There was no dramatic explosion. No towering wall of water. No instant chaos. Just a distant scrape. A vibration. A brief interruption. The sort of thing many people might have ignored entirely. Unfortunately, Ice possesses a remarkable ability to ruin expensive engineering projects. As the crew gradually realized the extent of the damage, a terrible truth emerged. The ship was doomed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Water entered compartments. The bow settled lower, and the enormous vessel began its slow descent toward the ocean floor. At first, many passengers struggled to comprehend what was happening. After all, they were standing aboard one of the largest ships ever built. It felt impossible. Surely the experts would solve the problem. Surely someone had a plan. Surely all this modern technology counted for something. History occasionally enjoys reminding humanity that confidence and competence are not always the same thing. As lifeboats were prepared, confusion spread. Orders changed. Rumors circulated. Some people hesitated to leave the ship. Others desperately sought places aboard the boats. The night air grew colder. The ocean remained indifferent. And somewhere amid this unfolding disaster was young Frank. Imagine being a child during those final hours. Adults rushing around. Voices raised. Instructions shouted. Fear spreading from person to person like an invisible current. Children often understand more than adults realize. Even when they don't fully grasp events, they can sense emotions. And there was plenty of emotion that night: fear, uncertainty, disbelief. The kind of disbelief that appears when people suddenly realize the impossible is happening. Eventually, Frank and his family managed to reach safety. A remarkable stroke of fortune. Thousands did not. As the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves during the early hours of April 15, the disaster became one of the defining tragedies of the 20th century. More than 1,500 people lost their lives. Families were separated. Dreams vanished. Entire futures disappeared into the icy Atlantic. For survivors, the experience left lasting scars. Some rarely spoke about it. Others spent years trying to make sense of it. Many carried memories they could never entirely escape. Young Frank, however, had his entire life ahead of him. Or so it seemed. The years passed. The world moved forward. The Titanic became history. New headlines replaced old ones. New crises emerged. And gradually, the disaster faded into memory for much of the public. But not for the people who had lived through it. Frank grew older. He entered adulthood. The world around him changed dramatically. The First World War arrived. Empires fell. Borders shifted. Entire political systems collapsed. The 20th century was proving extraordinarily busy. One sometimes wonders if history ever considered taking a short vacation. Apparently not. As the decades unfolded, maritime travel remained an essential part of life. Ships continued crossing oceans. Passengers continued boarding vessels. And despite his childhood experience, Frank eventually found himself connected to another famous ship. This one called the Empress of Britain. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Empress of Britain, don't worry. Most people today are. Which is slightly unfair. Because at the time, it was one of the most impressive passenger liners in the world. Large, elegant, fast. A source of considerable national pride. Humanity, it seems, never loses faith in building enormous floating objects. The Empress of Britain entered service during the 1930s. Passengers admired it. Companies promoted it. Photographs celebrated it. And for a while, everything went according to plan, which must have felt refreshing. Then came another world war. Because the 20th century wasn't finished causing problems yet. When the Second World War erupted, civilian ships often found themselves drawn into military service. Passenger liners became troop transports, cargo carriers, strategic assets. Suddenly, vessels designed for comfort found themselves participating in global conflict. The Empress of Britain was no exception. The ship's role changed dramatically. Its voyages became more dangerous. The oceans themselves became battlefields. German submarines prowled beneath the waves. Aircraft searched for targets. Merchant vessels traveled under constant threat. Every journey carried risk. And somehow, improbably, Frank Osman once again found himself connected to a ship destined for disaster. The odds alone seem almost absurd. Surviving one of history's most famous shipwrecks is already extraordinary. Finding yourself aboard another doomed vessel decades later feels like something a novelist might reject for being unrealistic. Yet history often ignores literary criticism. In October 1940, the Empress of Britain came under attack. German aircraft located the vessel. Bombs fell. Explosions erupted. Fire spread. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Crew members fought to save the ship. Damage control teams worked desperately. Smoke filled the air. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. For those on board, it must have felt terrifyingly familiar. Not identical to the Titanic, but familiar enough. Another great ship in trouble. Another emergency. Another desperate struggle for survival. Frank once again faced circumstances few people could imagine. Most individuals spend their entire lives without witnessing a major maritime disaster. He had now experienced two. The Empress of Britain did not immediately sink. For a time there remained hope. Salvage efforts continued. Crews attempted to preserve the vessel. But fate, unfortunately, had additional plans. The damaged ship was eventually torpedoed and finally disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Another giant vessel lost to the sea. Another chapter written into maritime history. And remarkably, Frank survived again, twice. Two famous disasters. Two separate oceans of chaos. Two encounters with death. And somehow he emerged from both alive. The sheer improbability of it feels almost dreamlike. Like a story invented during a particularly imaginative evening. Yet it happened. A boy who survived the Titanic. A man who survived the sinking of the Empress of Britain. A life connected to two of history's most extraordinary maritime tragedies. As we slowly drift toward the next part of tonight's story, imagine the strange weight of such experiences. Imagine carrying memories of one legendary disaster, only to witness another decades later. Imagine watching the world remember the Titanic while knowing you had stood upon its decks. Imagine surviving events so rare that historians would spend generations discussing them. And most of all, imagine being Frank Osman, a man who spent much of his life proving that history occasionally has an astonishing sense of coincidence. When we left Frank Osman, He had already accomplished something that sounds statistically unreasonable. He had survived the Titanic. Then, decades later, he survived the sinking of the Empress of Britain. Most people would consider either experience more than sufficient for one lifetime. History, however, occasionally develops a peculiar attachment to certain individuals. And Frank seems to have been one of them. Tonight, let's drift a little deeper into the strange coincidence that connected his life to two famous maritime disasters. Because the more closely you examine the story, the more unusual it becomes. The Titanic and the Empress of Britain belong to different eras. Different worlds, really. The Titanic represented the final years before the First World War. An age of grand empires, elegant ocean liners, formal dinners, and extraordinary confidence in modern technology. People often imagine the years before 1914 as a calmer time. And in some ways they were, at least compared to what followed. But beneath the surface, tensions were already building. The world was changing rapidly. Industrial power was expanding. Military rivalries were intensifying. And Europe was quietly preparing for an argument of historic proportions. An argument that would eventually involve trenches, artillery, and an astonishing amount of paperwork. The Titanic sailed directly into this world. Its passengers represented many different backgrounds. Millionaires occupied luxurious suites. Immigrant families crowded into modest accommodations. Businessmen carried plans. Children carried toys. Everyone carried expectations. Very few carried lifeboats, which, unfortunately, became a significant issue later. One of the enduring mysteries surrounding the Titanic is how normal everything seemed before disaster struck. History rarely announces itself in advance. Nobody woke up that morning thinking they were participating in one of the most famous events of the century. They were simply passengers on a ship, having breakfast, reading newspapers, walking decks, complaining about minor inconveniences, doing all the ordinary things people do before discovering they have accidentally wandered into a history book. Young Frank experienced all of this through the eyes of a child. Children often notice details adults overlook. The creaking of corridors, the endless hallways, the excitement of exploration, the novelty of life aboard a giant ship. For a young boy, the Titanic must have seemed enormous, almost like a floating city, a place where every corridor led somewhere new, a place where adults seemed confident that everything was under control. Adults enjoy appearing confident. Reality does not always cooperate. When the collision occurred on the night of April 14, 1912, confusion spread gradually. The disaster unfolded slowly, painfully slowly, and perhaps that made it even more frightening. People had time to think, time to wonder, time to hope, time to worry. A sudden catastrophe can overwhelm the mind. A slow catastrophe allows the imagination to participate. And imagination can be remarkably unhelpful during emergencies. As lifeboats departed, many were not completely full. This remains one of the most tragic aspects of the entire event. At first, passengers struggled to believe the ship was actually sinking. Some hesitated to leave. Others preferred the apparent safety of the vessel itself. After all, standing aboard a giant ship often feels safer than climbing into a small wooden boat floating in freezing darkness. The logic was understandable. Unfortunately, the ocean had already made its decision. For survivors like Frank, rescue eventually arrived. The RMS Carpathia reached the scene and collected those who remained alive. Imagine that moment. Hours of fear, hours of uncertainty, then distant lights appearing across the water. A reminder that the world still existed beyond the darkness. For many survivors, that sight became unforgettable. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just deeply relieving. The sort of relief that leaves people too exhausted to celebrate. Frank returned to ordinary life, or at least as ordinary as life can be after surviving one of history's most famous disasters. The years passed, and the world changed. The Titanic became legend. Books appeared. Investigations followed. Newspapers analyzed every decision, every mistake, every missed opportunity. Human beings possess an endless appetite for asking what should have happened after discovering what actually happened. Naturally, nobody possessed a time machine, so the discussions continued indefinitely. Meanwhile, Frank grew older. The frightened child became an adult, and eventually, the world entered another catastrophic chapter. The Second World War. Now, unlike the Titanic disaster, which lasted a single night, the Second World War lasted years. Entire continents became battlefields. Cities were bombed. Nations mobilized. Millions of lives changed forever. Even the oceans became dangerous. Merchant ships traveled under constant threat. Passenger liners suddenly found themselves serving military purposes. Luxury gave way to necessity. Comfort gave way to survival. And among these ships was the Empress of Britain. The vessel was magnificent. One of the largest passenger liners of its time, fast, elegant, respected. The sort of ship people admired from docks. The sort of ship companies proudly displayed in advertisements. In short, exactly the kind of vessel history enjoys placing in danger. By 1940, war had transformed the Atlantic Ocean. Submarines lurked beneath the waves. Aircraft searched from above. Convoys crossed dangerous waters carrying troops and supplies. Every voyage involved uncertainty. Every captain understood the risks. And yet ships continued sailing. Because wars require movement, people, equipment, food, fuel. Entire nations depended upon maritime transport. Stopping was not an option. The Empress of Britain found itself operating in this dangerous environment. Then came October 1940, a date Frank Osman probably would have preferred not to experience. German reconnaissance aircraft located the vessel. Bombers followed. Explosions shook the ship. Fire spread through its structure. Crew members responded immediately. Damage control teams fought flames. Officers organized evacuation procedures. Passengers and personnel attempted to remain calm, which is generally easier in theory than practice. Smoke drifted across decks. The ocean stretched endlessly around them. And once again, Frank found himself aboard a ship fighting for survival. One cannot help wondering what thoughts passed through his mind. Did memories of the Titanic return? Did familiar fears resurface? Did he recognize certain sounds, certain emotions, Certain patterns. Human memory works in strange ways. Experiences separated by decades can suddenly feel very close together, especially during moments of stress, especially when circumstances resemble old nightmares. The attack caused extensive damage, yet the Empress of Britain did not immediately sink. For a while, hope remained. Salvage vessels arrived. Plans were developed. Efforts continued. There was a genuine possibility that the ship might be saved. History, however, remained in one of its less cooperative moods. Several days later, a German submarine encountered the damaged vessel. Torpedoes struck. The situation became hopeless. Eventually, the ship sank. Another giant liner disappeared beneath Atlantic waters. Another maritime disaster entered the historical record. And somehow, Frank survived again. The odds become almost difficult to comprehend. Millions of people crossed oceans during the 20th century. Most never experienced a shipwreck. Many never even encountered a serious emergency at sea. Frank experienced two major maritime disasters connected to famous ships. The probability alone seems extraordinary. Historians occasionally encounter stories that sound fictional despite being entirely true. This is one of them. Yet perhaps the most interesting aspect of Frank's story is not luck. At least not entirely. Luck certainly played a role. Surviving either disaster required fortunate circumstances. Surviving both required even more. But survival also depends upon countless small decisions. Where someone happens to stand. Which lifeboat they reach. Who helps them? What choices are made during moments of confusion? History often appears shaped by enormous forces, wars, governments, economies, technologies. Yet individual lives frequently turn on tiny moments nobody notices at the time. A step to the left, a delayed decision, a conversation lasting 30 seconds longer than expected. The difference between survival and tragedy can sometimes be astonishingly small. Frank's life serves as a reminder of that reality. He was not a king, not a general, not a famous politician. He did not command armies. He did not negotiate treaties. Yet his story became remarkable because he happened to stand at the intersection of two extraordinary events. The child survivor of the Titanic. The adult survivor of the Empress of Britain. A witness to two disasters separated by nearly 3 decades. History sometimes produces strange echoes. Events repeat. Patterns return. Lives become connected in unexpected ways. And Frank Osman became one of those connections. A living bridge between two very different eras of maritime history. As the years continued passing, people remained fascinated by his experiences. Understandably so. After all, how many individuals can truthfully claim to have survived two legendary shipwrecks? Not many. And certainly not many whose stories were documented so clearly. As we drift toward the next part of tonight's journey, we'll move beyond the disasters themselves and explore how survivors carried these experiences throughout their lives. Because surviving an event is one thing. Living with the memory of it is something else entirely. And for people like Frank Osman, history didn't end when the ships disappeared beneath the waves. In many ways, that was only the beginning. Surviving a disaster is often where most historical stories end. A ship sinks. People are rescued. Newspapers publish headlines. Investigations begin. Books eventually appear. And history moves on. For the people who actually lived through those events, however, the story rarely ends there. In many ways, it is only beginning. Because surviving something extraordinary creates a peculiar challenge. You must somehow return to ordinary life afterward. And ordinary life can feel surprisingly strange after witnessing catastrophe. Frank Osman understood this better than most. Not only had he survived the Titanic as a child, but decades later he had survived the loss of the Empress of Britain. Two disasters. Two brushes with death. Two moments when the world suddenly became uncertain. And then, after each event, he faced the same task. Continuing. Getting up the next morning. Finding a way forward. History tends to focus on dramatic moments. The iceberg. The explosions. The sinking ships. But human lives are usually built from quieter things. Breakfasts. Conversations, work, family, routine. The thousands of small activities that fill ordinary days. After a disaster, those ordinary activities do not disappear. People still need to live. Which sounds obvious. Yet it may be one of the hardest parts of survival. Imagine spending hours convinced you might die. Then, days later, being expected to answer letters, pay bills, attend appointments, discuss the weather. The contrast can feel almost absurd. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to adapt. Sometimes that adaptation happens quickly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it never fully happens at all. The early 20th century was not especially known for discussing emotional trauma. Modern societies often encourage people to talk about difficult experiences. Not always successfully, admittedly. But the effort exists. A century ago, things were rather different. People were generally expected to carry on. Keep moving. Remain stoic. Continue functioning. If emotions became inconvenient, the preferred solution was often pretending they didn't exist. A strategy with a mixed record of success. Many Titanic survivors rarely spoke about their experiences. Some avoided the topic entirely. Others shared only fragments. The memories remained, but the words stayed hidden. This was not unusual. The disaster had been terrifying. The loss enormous. For many survivors, discussing it meant reopening wounds they preferred to leave alone. Frank belonged to a generation raised with strong expectations regarding endurance. People simply endured things, wars, economic hardships, personal tragedies, loss. They endured because there seemed little alternative. Whether that approach was healthy is a separate question. History rarely consults modern therapists before making decisions. As the years passed, Frank watched the Titanic evolve from tragedy into legend. This transformation must have felt strange. One moment in his life gradually became one of the most famous events in modern history. Books appeared. Films were produced. Researchers debated details. Artifacts were collected. Museums displayed exhibits. The world became fascinated with a disaster he had personally experienced. For most people, the Titanic exists as a story. For Frank, it was a memory. Those are not quite the same thing. Stories tend to become polished over time. Details simplify. Narratives emerge. Heroes and villains appear. Reality is usually messier. Reality contains confusion, fear, random chance, moments nobody remembers clearly. The actual experience of living through an event rarely resembles the version presented decades later. And yet the legend continued growing. Each generation rediscovered the Titanic. Each generation found new reasons to be fascinated. Perhaps because the disaster contained so many themes people find compelling. Technology, pride. Class divisions, heroism, tragedy. Human error. A giant ship meeting a giant iceberg. History, occasionally, writes with remarkable efficiency. The symbolism practically creates itself. Then there was the Empress of Britain. Less famous today, yet still significant, especially for those who experienced its final voyage. The ship's loss occurred during wartime, and wartime tragedies often become overshadowed by larger events. The Second World War produced so many headlines that individual disasters sometimes disappeared beneath the sheer volume of history occurring simultaneously. Entire cities were being bombed. Armies were advancing. Governments were collapsing. Against that backdrop, even the sinking of a major ocean liner could struggle to maintain public attention. History can be surprisingly competitive. Yet for survivors, the scale of broader events changes nothing. Personal experiences remain personal. Fear remains fear. Loss remains loss. The ocean remains cold regardless of how many other headlines exist. Frank carried memories from both disasters throughout his life. One can only imagine the perspective this created. Most people compare events using stories they have heard. Frank could compare them using experiences he had actually lived. He understood what it felt like to watch panic spread across a ship. He understood uncertainty. He understood rescue. And perhaps most importantly, he understood how quickly normal life can change. This may be one reason survivor stories remain so fascinating. They remind us that history is not merely a collection of dates. History is people. Ordinary people. People eating meals. Making plans. Thinking about tomorrow. Then suddenly finding themselves inside events that future generations will study. Few passengers boarding the Titanic expected historians to discuss them more than a century later. Few people aboard the Empress of Britain imagined their voyage would become part of maritime history. They were simply living their lives. History arrived uninvited, as it often does. There is another interesting aspect to Frank's story: luck or fate, or coincidence. Choose whichever term feels most comfortable. Human beings have debated the subject for thousands of years. Some prefer luck. Others prefer destiny. Historians generally prefer evidence. Yet even historians occasionally encounter coincidences that make them pause. Surviving one famous shipwreck is unusual. Surviving two is extraordinary. The odds alone invite reflection. People naturally search for meaning in such situations. Was Frank exceptionally fortunate? Exceptionally unlucky? A combination of both? The answer depends largely upon perspective. After all, surviving two disasters suggests remarkable luck. Being present for two disasters suggests something else entirely. Life occasionally refuses to fit neatly into categories. Frank's experiences certainly fall into that category. Another curious reality about survival is that it often creates responsibility. Not official responsibility. Not legal responsibility. Something quieter. The responsibility of memory. When many people do not survive an event, those who remain become witnesses. They carry stories forward. They preserve details. They remember names. History depends upon such people. Without witnesses, countless experiences would simply disappear. The Titanic itself demonstrates this perfectly. Much of what we know comes from survivors. People who described the final hours. People who shared observations. People who recorded memories. Their testimonies transformed personal experiences into historical records. Without them, much of the disaster would remain unknown. Frank became part of that process. Not because he sought fame. Not because he wanted attention. But because survival placed him in a position few others occupied. He became one of the rare individuals capable of describing two major maritime catastrophes from first-hand experience. That perspective carried value, even decades later. As he grew older, the world around him changed dramatically. Technology advanced. Transportation improved. Communication accelerated. The ships of his youth gradually disappeared. Ocean liners that once dominated travel became less important. Airplanes transformed long-distance transportation. Journeys that once required days at sea could suddenly be completed in hours. The age of great passenger liners slowly faded. For someone like Frank, these changes must have been extraordinary to witness. He had lived through an era when giant ships connected continents. He had watched some of the most famous among them disappear beneath the waves. And now he was seeing an entirely different world emerge. History often feels slow while it is happening. Looking back, it appears remarkably fast. Decades compress into paragraphs. Generations become chapters. Lives become summaries. Yet individuals experience history one day at a time. Frank's life stretched across enormous changes. Empires rose and fell. Wars reshaped continents. Technology transformed daily existence. And through it all, he carried memories from two unforgettable nights at sea. Perhaps that is what makes his story so compelling. Not simply the disasters themselves, but the human experience surrounding them. The persistence, the adaptation, the quiet continuation afterward. Because surviving a catastrophe is dramatic. Living the rest of your life afterward is something else entirely. And as we drift gently toward the next part of our journey, we'll explore the broader world of Titanic survivors, the strange paths their lives followed, and why some spent decades trying to escape history, while others became forever linked to it. After all, escaping a sinking ship is one challenge. Escaping a famous story can be much more difficult. By the time Frank Osman reached adulthood, the Titanic had already become something larger than a ship. It had become a symbol. And symbols have a curious habit of refusing to stay in the past. The actual disaster lasted only a few hours. The story lasted generations. Long after the survivors returned home, the Titanic continued drifting through public imagination. Newspaper articles appeared. Books were published. Lectures were given. Investigations were revisited. And every few years, another generation discovered the story all over again. For survivors, this created a strange situation. Imagine experiencing a traumatic event as a child, then spending the rest of your life watching the world discuss it again and again and again. Many Titanic survivors found themselves permanently connected to a single night in April 1912. No matter what else they accomplished, no matter where life took them, the Titanic remained attached to their names. History can be surprisingly possessive. One survivor became a teacher. Another built a successful business. Others raised families, served in wars, moved across continents, lived long and complicated lives. Yet newspaper headlines often introduced them in exactly the same way. Titanic survivor. As if everything else that happened afterward was merely a footnote. Frank experienced this phenomenon too. Because no matter how many decades passed, the Titanic remained one of the first things people noticed about his story. The irony is that surviving the Titanic probably occupied only a tiny fraction of his actual life. A few days. A few terrifying hours. Yet those hours became immortal. Meanwhile, decades of ordinary living faded into the background. History tends to favor drama. It rarely gives equal attention to grocery shopping. Another challenge facing survivors involved memory itself. Memory is not a photograph. It changes. Details fade. Certain moments become sharper. Others disappear entirely. People reconstruct events over time, sometimes without realizing it. This does not mean they are dishonest. It simply means they are human. The Titanic became one of the most heavily investigated disasters in history. Researchers compared survivor accounts, collected testimonies, examined inconsistencies, cross-referenced timelines, and discovered something interesting. Different people remembered the same events differently. One passenger remembered calm. Another remembered chaos. One recalled specific conversations. Another could not. This confused some investigators. But modern psychologists would not find it surprising at all. Human memory is wonderfully useful and occasionally unreliable, especially during stressful situations. The brain prioritizes survival over perfect record-keeping, which is understandable. A person trying not to freeze in the North Atlantic generally has other concerns besides assisting future historians. Frank's recollections formed part of this larger tapestry of survivor memory. Each account contributed another piece of the puzzle, another perspective, another glimpse into one of history's most famous nights. Yet there was something unique about Frank. Unlike many survivors, he eventually acquired a second catastrophic maritime experience. The Empress of Britain added an entirely different layer to his story, and perhaps gave him a perspective very few people could share. Most Titanic survivors spent years comparing their experiences to ordinary life. Frank had another disaster for comparison, a rather unusual category of expertise, not one many people seek deliberately. The two events occurred in completely different worlds. The Titanic belonged to the age before the First World War. The Empress of Britain belonged to the age of global conflict and mechanized warfare. Comparing them was almost like comparing different centuries. The passengers were different. The technology was different. The dangers were different. Yet beneath those differences remained familiar human reactions: fear, hope, confusion, courage, the eternal belief that somehow things will work out, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Human optimism is remarkably persistent, sometimes admirably so, sometimes alarmingly so. As the years passed, public fascination with the Titanic only increased. One reason may be that the disaster sits at the intersection of so many historical themes: class, technology, hubris, nature, luck, human error. Virtually every historian can find something interesting within the story. Engineers examine design decisions. Sociologists study social divisions. Psychologists analyze human behavior. Maritime historians investigate navigation and safety procedures. Everybody gets something. The Titanic is essentially a buffet for historians, which explains why people keep returning to it. Frank watched this process unfold throughout his lifetime. He witnessed the disaster transform from recent tragedy into historical legend, then into popular culture, then into something approaching mythology. Each generation interpreted it slightly differently. The facts remained largely unchanged. The meanings shifted. This happens with many historical events. People often use the past to answer questions about the present. A society concerned about technology might view the Titanic as a warning about overconfidence. A society concerned about inequality might focus on class differences among passengers. A society concerned about leadership might examine decisions made by officers and executives. The event remains the same. The lessons evolve. Meanwhile, survivors continued growing older. One by one, the generation that experienced the Titanic began disappearing. Children became adults. Adults became elderly. Witnesses became memories. The living connection to 1912 gradually weakened. History was moving from experience into archive. This transition happens to every generation eventually. People who witnessed extraordinary events age. Their numbers shrink. Their voices become rarer. And suddenly historians realize they are no longer interviewing participants. They are studying records. By the middle of the 20th century, many Titanic survivors were already elderly. Some had spent decades avoiding publicity. Others occasionally shared their experiences. A few became minor public figures simply because people remained fascinated by the disaster. Frank belonged to a very small and unusual category. Not only a Titanic survivor, not only a survivor of the Empress of Britain, but someone whose life connected two major chapters of maritime history. One could almost view his biography as a bridge stretching across the first half of the 20th century. A child aboard the Titanic. An adult aboard a wartime liner. A witness to both peace and war. Both technological optimism and military destruction. History occasionally creates individuals whose lives seem designed to illustrate larger themes. Frank was one of them. Of course, none of this means his life was defined entirely by disaster. That would be an unfair simplification. People are always more than the famous events attached to them. The challenge is that history often compresses lives into neat summaries. Titanic survivor, war hero, explorer, king. The label becomes larger than the person. Reality is usually more complicated. Behind every historical title exists an ordinary human being. Someone who worried, made mistakes, got tired, had favorite meals, complained about weather, lost keys, missed trains, or their historical equivalent. History tends to remove these details, yet they are often the most human parts. Frank undoubtedly experienced countless ordinary moments between his encounters with history. Years filled with routines, conversations, work, friendships, the simple texture of everyday life. Those years rarely appear in headlines, but they make up the majority of existence. Perhaps that is another reason his story resonates. Because beneath the extraordinary circumstances lies something familiar. A person continuing forward despite difficult experiences, adapting, persisting, building a life after events that could easily have defined everything. Many people understand that challenge, even if their experiences differ dramatically. Life rarely unfolds according to plan. Unexpected events arrive, some pleasant, some devastating, and somehow people continue. Not perfectly, not always gracefully, but they continue. Frank's life reflected that reality on a larger scale than most. As the decades rolled onward, ships became safer. Technology improved. Regulations evolved. Lessons were learned, often because previous generations paid dearly to teach them. The Titanic influenced maritime safety reforms around the world. Lifeboat requirements changed. Communication procedures improved. International cooperation increased. History occasionally advances through wisdom. More often, it advances through expensive mistakes. The Titanic certainly qualified as an expensive mistake. One measured not merely in money, but in lives. Yet from tragedy emerged reforms that protected future travelers. A small consolation, but a real one. And as we gently drift toward the next part of tonight's story, we'll explore the astonishing odds surrounding Frank Osman's experiences, the mathematics of coincidence, and why certain lives seem to attract extraordinary events while most pass quietly through history unnoticed. Because sometimes the most fascinating question isn't what happened, it's how it happened at all. History is filled with unlikely events. A king survives a battle because an arrow strikes a belt buckle instead of a rib. A messenger arrives 5 minutes too late and changes the course of a war. A storm appears at exactly the wrong moment and destroys an entire fleet. These stories often feel extraordinary because they remind us how fragile events can be. Tiny changes sometimes produce enormous consequences. And when it comes to unlikely stories, Frank Osman occupies a rather special category. Because surviving the Titanic was already improbable, surviving another major ship disaster decades later feels almost absurd. The kind of coincidence that causes people to raise an eyebrow and ask if someone has perhaps exaggerated a detail. Yet the records are quite clear. Frank really was there twice. Now, human beings have a curious relationship with probability. We understand it in theory. In practice, we often struggle. If something is unlikely, we assume it probably won't happen, which is generally reasonable. The problem is that unlikely things happen constantly. They have to. Given enough people and enough time, even extremely improbable events eventually occur. Somebody wins lotteries. Somebody gets struck by lightning more than once. Somebody accidentally discovers penicillin because they forgot to clean a laboratory. History is partly the study of enormous events. It is also partly the study of astonishing coincidences. Frank's life reminds us of that reality. Imagine boarding the Titanic in 1912. Imagine surviving. Then imagine living through the following decades. The First World War, the Great Depression, the rise of aviation, the emergence of radio, the countless transformations of the early 20th century. Most people would assume the dramatic chapter of their life had already occurred. The universe, however, apparently disagreed. The second disaster arrived nearly 30 years later. Long enough for memories to fade. Long enough for life to settle into routine. Long enough for someone to believe that such experiences belonged firmly in the past. Then came the Empress of Britain. Another giant vessel. Another crisis at sea. Another desperate struggle for survival. There is something almost surreal about it. Not because history lacks disasters. History contains more than enough disasters to satisfy everyone. The remarkable part is the repetition. The same individual finding himself connected to two separate maritime catastrophes that would later be remembered by historians. It feels like the plot of a novel. Yet reality occasionally displays a surprising lack of restraint. Of course, luck itself is a complicated concept. When people hear Frank's story, they often reach different conclusions. Some consider him extraordinarily lucky. After all, he survived both disasters. Others argue he was extraordinarily unlucky. After all, he was present for both disasters in the first place. Both perspectives contain a certain logic. This is one of the strange features of survival stories. The same event can appear fortunate or unfortunate, depending upon where you choose to begin the narrative. If you start with the sinking ships, Frank seems unlucky. If you start with the survival, he seems lucky. History frequently depends upon perspective. There is another interesting aspect to this story. Human beings are natural pattern seekers. We love finding connections. Sometimes the connections are real. Sometimes they exist only in our imagination. And sometimes they occupy an uncomfortable space between the two. When people hear about Frank, they instinctively search for meaning. Perhaps he possessed unusual resilience. Perhaps fate protected him. Perhaps destiny had plans. Or perhaps he simply encountered two extraordinarily improbable situations and managed to survive both. The final explanation is generally the one historians prefer. It is less romantic, but usually more reliable. Still, one cannot entirely blame people for searching for deeper significance. Stories like this invite it. Throughout history, many cultures developed elaborate beliefs regarding luck. Ancient Romans consulted omens. Medieval rulers consulted astrologers. Sailors carried charms. Kings employed fortune tellers. Entire civilizations attempted to negotiate with uncertainty, usually with mixed results. The future remained stubbornly unpredictable, and the ocean remained particularly uninterested in human expectations. Sailors have always understood this better than most. The sea possesses a reputation for indifference. Storms do not care whether a passenger is wealthy or poor. Waves do not pause to consider future plans. Icebergs rarely seek permission before causing trouble. The ocean simply exists, powerful, beautiful, and occasionally catastrophic. The Titanic demonstrated this lesson dramatically. One of the largest ships ever built encountered a block of ice. The result became one of history's most famous disasters. The imbalance is almost comical. Thousands of tons of steel defeated by frozen water. Nature occasionally enjoys making philosophical points. The Empress of Britain offered a different lesson. Not about nature, about war. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to create dangers far more complicated than icebergs. By 1940, technology had transformed warfare. Aircraft could locate ships from the sky. Submarines could strike from beneath the sea. Entire oceans became hunting grounds. The dangers facing sailors had evolved dramatically. Yet the outcome remained familiar. Another great vessel disappeared beneath the waves. Another group of survivors carried memories for the rest of their lives. And among them was Frank, again. One sometimes wonders how he felt whenever someone suggested taking a sea voyage afterward. Perhaps he politely declined. Perhaps he stared thoughtfully into the distance. Perhaps he developed an entirely reasonable preference for remaining on land. Nobody could blame him. At a certain point, even the most enthusiastic traveler might decide that oceans are overrated. Yet history suggests that many survivors eventually returned to normal routines. Human adaptability remains one of our most remarkable characteristics. People recover. Not completely. Not always quickly. But often surprisingly well. They build new lives. Create new memories. Continue forward. Frank seems to have done exactly that. His story endured not because he spent decades discussing his experiences, but because the experiences themselves were so extraordinary. 2 shipwrecks. 2 survival stories. 1 lifetime. The sheer simplicity of the facts creates their own fascination. Historians often spend enormous effort analyzing complicated events. Political movements. Economic systems. Military campaigns. Then occasionally, a story appears that requires very little explanation. A boy survives the Titanic. The same person later survives the sinking of the Empress of Britain. The facts speak for themselves. Sometimes history writes elegantly. There is also a broader lesson hidden within stories like this. Most people living through historical events do not realize they are doing so. Passengers boarding the Titanic saw a ship, not a future legend. Passengers aboard the Empress of Britain saw transportation, not a future chapter in maritime history. Life rarely arrives with labels attached. People simply live through events one day at a time. Only later does history decide which moments were important. Frank could not possibly have known, as a child in 1912, that people would still discuss the Titanic more than a century later. Nor could he have known that his connection to another famous shipwreck would make his story even more unusual. The future remained hidden, as it always does. Perhaps that uncertainty is what makes history so fascinating. People in the past never knew how their stories would end. They worried about ordinary problems, made imperfect decisions, tried their best, and occasionally wandered into extraordinary circumstances, just like everyone else. The difference is that some of those circumstances eventually become famous. As evening settles a little deeper around us, and the world grows quieter, imagine Frank looking back across his life. Imagine the memories stretching behind him. The decks of the Titanic, the cold Atlantic night, the rescue. Then decades later, another ship, another emergency, another survival, a lifetime connected by water and chance. Not because he sought adventure, not because he chased history, but because history occasionally arrived at his doorstep without invitation. There is a curious moment that arrives in every long life. A moment when a person gradually stops being merely someone who experienced history and starts becoming part of history itself. It happens slowly, almost invisibly. One day you are remembering events. The next day people are asking you about them. Then suddenly researchers are taking notes while you speak. Students are reading about things you personally witnessed. And before long, your memories have become historical sources. Frank Osman eventually reached that point. As the 20th century moved forward, the generation that remembered the Titanic began growing smaller. The children who survived became elderly. The adults who survived became very elderly. And eventually, many were gone entirely. Time is remarkably efficient at this sort of thing. It never hurries, yet somehow it never stops. For younger generations, the Titanic increasingly belonged to history books, photographs, documentaries, museum exhibits. The disaster felt distant, almost mythical, like something that happened in another world. And in many ways it had. The world of 1912 differed dramatically from the world that followed. Imagine explaining modern life to a Titanic passenger. Airplanes crossing oceans in hours. Television, computers, mobile phones, satellites, the internet. They would likely assume you had spent too much time near the ship's boiler rooms. Likewise, many modern people struggle to imagine daily life in 1912. A world without television, without commercial aviation, without digital communication, without countless conveniences that today seem ordinary. History often feels distant because the details of everyday life change so dramatically. Yet people themselves remain surprisingly familiar. They still worried, still hoped, still made plans, still complained about weather. Human nature evolves much more slowly than technology. This is one reason survivor stories remain valuable. They create a bridge, a direct connection between different eras. When someone like Frank described his experiences, listeners gained something more than information. They gained perspective. Facts tell us what happened. Witnesses tell us what it felt like. The distinction matters. A history book can explain that the Titanic struck an iceberg. A survivor can describe the silence afterward. The uncertainty, the confusion, the strange realization that something was terribly wrong. Both forms of knowledge are useful. Together they create a fuller picture. As Frank grew older, he found himself belonging to a shrinking group. Not merely Titanic survivors. Not merely survivors of the Empress of Britain, but people who remembered the early 20th century firsthand. The world he had known as a child was disappearing. Not physically, but culturally. Memories were fading. Witnesses were passing away. History was slowly transforming into archive. This process happens with every generation. The people who remember become fewer. Their stories become more valuable. Then eventually, the stories become all that remain. One of the more interesting aspects of historical memory is how selective it can be. Certain events remain famous. Others fade. The Titanic became one of the most recognizable disasters in human history. The Empress of Britain, despite its significance, never achieved quite the same level of public recognition. Why? Partly timing, partly symbolism, partly circumstance. History does not distribute attention evenly. Some stories capture the imagination. Others quietly drift into obscurity. The Titanic possessed almost everything required for a lasting legend. A giant ship, a maiden voyage, a famous disaster, wealthy passengers, heroic stories, tragic losses. The narrative practically wrote itself. Writers, filmmakers, and historians could hardly resist. The Empress of Britain faced a different challenge. Its sinking occurred during the Second World War. And the Second World War contained so many extraordinary events that individual stories often struggled for attention. Entire cities were burning. Armies were moving across continents. Governments were collapsing. Against such a backdrop, even major maritime disasters risked becoming footnotes. History can be surprisingly unfair. Yet Frank connected both stories. His life served as a thread, linking two different eras of maritime tragedy. A child survivor from one famous disaster, an adult survivor from another. The connection itself became part of the fascination. People love unusual patterns. And Frank's life contained one of the most unusual patterns imaginable. Of course, there is a danger in focusing too heavily on coincidence. Coincidences make wonderful stories, but they can sometimes distract from deeper themes. And Frank's story contains several. Resilience, for example. Not dramatic resilience. Not the kind celebrated in motivational speeches. Something quieter. The ability to continue. To move forward after frightening experiences. To build a life despite difficult memories. Most survivors eventually face this challenge. History often celebrates survival itself. Less attention goes toward what happens afterward. The years, the decades, the ordinary moments that follow extraordinary events. Yet those years matter, perhaps even more than the disasters themselves. Because surviving one night is impressive. Living an entire life afterward requires something different: patience, adaptation, persistence. Qualities that rarely receive dramatic music in documentaries. Another theme involves memory. Not merely personal memory. Collective memory. The way societies remember events. The Titanic became part of collective memory, a shared story passed between generations. People who never saw the ship still recognize its name. People who never visited the Atlantic still know about the iceberg. Few historical disasters achieve that level of recognition. Frank lived long enough to witness this transformation firsthand. He watched memory become history, then watched history become legend, and eventually watched legend become popular culture. It is a strange journey for any event, perhaps even stranger for someone who actually experienced it. Imagine seeing a film about one of your childhood memories. Imagine watching actors recreate moments you lived through. Imagine hearing audiences discuss an event that, for you, remains personal. The experience must feel surreal. Many survivors described similar feelings. History belongs to everyone. Memories belong to individuals. Sometimes the two overlap awkwardly. As the late 20th century approached, interest in historical preservation increased. Museums expanded collections. Researchers recorded interviews. Archivists gathered documents. People became increasingly aware that direct witnesses would not be around forever. This awareness created urgency. Questions needed asking. Stories needed preserving. Memories needed recording. Before time carried them away, Frank's experiences became part of that broader effort. Not because he sought attention, but because his story possessed historical value. Future generations wanted to understand. How did it feel? What happened? What did people think? Questions historians ask endlessly. And fortunately, questions some witnesses are willing to answer. The older Frank became, the more unusual his perspective appeared. Few individuals experienced what he experienced. Fewer still lived long enough to see entire generations study those experiences as history. That may be the strangest part of all. A child boards a ship. An accident occurs. Life continues. Then decades later, millions of people know the ship's name. Books fill libraries. Researchers debate details. And one ordinary passenger becomes a historical witness. Not through ambition, not through power, simply through circumstance. History occasionally chooses its storytellers in unexpected ways. As we slowly drift toward the next part of tonight's journey, we'll explore how the Titanic transformed from disaster into cultural phenomenon, why people remain fascinated by it more than a century later, and how survivors like Frank became permanent links between memory and myth. Because some events end when they happen. Others continue echoing across generations. The Titanic, it seems, never entirely stopped sailing through the public imagination. Most ships, even famous ones, eventually fade from public memory. For a few years, people remember them. For a few decades, historians study them. Then gradually, they disappear into archives and footnotes. The Titanic chose a different strategy. More than a century after its sinking, people still discuss it. Books continue appearing. Documentaries continue being filmed. Researchers continue debating details. And somehow an iceberg encountered in 1912 remains a topic of conversation in the modern world. This is rather unusual. History contains countless disasters. Most receive nowhere near the same attention. So why the Titanic? Why this ship? Why this story? Part of the answer lies in timing. The Titanic sailed during a fascinating moment in history. The world stood on the edge of enormous change. Industrial technology had reached extraordinary heights. Cities were growing rapidly. Engineering achievements seemed limitless. Many people genuinely believed humanity was entering an age where science could solve almost anything. Then came an iceberg. History occasionally enjoys reminding people to remain humble. The symbolism proved irresistible. A giant ship representing modern confidence meets a force of nature that does not care about confidence at all. The lesson practically writes itself. Writers noticed. Historians noticed. The public noticed. And the story endured. Another reason involves the passengers themselves. The Titanic carried people from dramatically different backgrounds. Millionaires traveled in luxury. Immigrant families traveled with little more than hope. Businessmen, teachers, children, workers, retirees. The ship contained a miniature version of society. When disaster struck, people naturally became interested in what happened to all of them. Individual stories emerged. Acts of courage, acts of sacrifice, acts of confusion, acts of extraordinary bad decision-making. Human nature displayed itself in all its complexity, which makes for compelling history. People rarely become fascinated by machines alone. They become fascinated by people. And the Titanic offered plenty. For survivors like Frank Osman, this growing fascination must have felt strange. Imagine watching an event from your childhood become one of the most famous stories ever told. Imagine seeing books dedicated to a single night you actually experienced. Imagine hearing strangers discuss details that remain personal memories for you. There is something almost surreal about it. Most people assume their childhood experiences belong primarily to themselves. Frank's childhood contained one of the most famous disasters in modern history. The ownership became somewhat shared. As decades passed, public interest only increased, particularly after the wreck itself was discovered in 1985. This moment transformed the story once again. For more than 70 years, the Titanic had rested unseen on the ocean floor. People knew where it had sunk, approximately, but the ship itself remained hidden, a ghost beneath the Atlantic. Then technology finally caught up. Exploration teams located the wreck. Photographs emerged. Images of the bow resting in darkness traveled around the world. Suddenly, the Titanic felt real again. Not merely a story. Not merely a legend. A physical place, existing quietly beneath miles of water. The discovery fascinated millions. Naturally, human beings possess an almost unlimited curiosity regarding lost things. Lost cities, lost treasures, lost ships. The Titanic managed to combine all three categories at once. Its rediscovery renewed global interest. Books multiplied. Television specials appeared. Researchers revisited old questions. The ship sailed into public imagination all over again. Frank lived during this renewed fascination. A fascinating thought. A survivor witnessing the discovery of the vessel he had escaped decades earlier. History occasionally folds back upon itself in remarkable ways. The passage of time creates unusual perspectives. A child survives the sinking. An old man watches explorers find the wreck. Few lives contain such extraordinary bookends. Of course, not everyone viewed the fascination positively. Some critics argued that the Titanic had become overly romanticized, that tragedy was being transformed into entertainment. A reasonable concern. After all, more than 1,500 people died. The event was not merely an adventure story. It was a disaster, a painful one. Yet this tension exists in much historical storytelling. How do people remember tragedy respectfully while still remaining interested? There is no perfect answer. Societies continue experimenting, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully. The Titanic sits directly at the center of this challenge. People are fascinated by the story. Yet the story involves real suffering, real families, real loss. Both realities must exist together. Frank's life offers an important reminder of that fact. Because behind every famous event stand actual individuals. People who experienced fear, uncertainty, relief, grief. The ship itself became famous. The passengers sometimes became symbols. Yet they were human beings first. That distinction matters. As the 20th century approached its end, another interesting shift occurred. The number of living Titanic survivors became very small. Every year there were fewer witnesses, fewer first-hand accounts, fewer people capable of saying, "I was there." This changed how people viewed the disaster. It moved further from memory and closer to history. The transition happens to every major event eventually. There comes a point when nobody remains alive to describe it personally. After that, society depends entirely upon records, letters, photographs, documents, recorded testimony. The voices remain, but the people themselves are gone. Frank belonged to one of the final generations able to bridge that gap. A living connection between modern audiences and a world that had vanished long ago. That connection carried value, not because he was famous, not because he sought attention, but because lived experience possesses a quality that books alone cannot fully reproduce. A witness changes the way people understand history. The details feel closer. The past feels more tangible. Suddenly 1912 is not merely a date. It becomes a memory someone carried throughout an entire lifetime. Perhaps this explains why survivor stories remain so powerful. They compress vast spans of history into individual lives. Instead of studying a disaster, we follow a person. Instead of analyzing statistics, we hear experiences. The scale becomes human. Frank's story accomplishes this beautifully. The Titanic becomes more than a famous ship. The Empress of Britain becomes more than a wartime casualty. Both become chapters in one man's life. A life shaped by extraordinary coincidence. And perhaps that is why people continue returning to stories like his. Not because they reveal grand historical theories. Not because they solve complex mysteries. But because they remind us that history happens to individuals. Ordinary individuals. People who board ships expecting routine journeys. People who wake up assuming tomorrow will resemble today. People who cannot possibly know that future generations will remember their experiences. History often appears enormous from a distance, Wars, empires, revolutions, disasters. Yet when viewed up close, it becomes surprisingly personal. One life, one memory, one story at a time. As we gently drift toward the next part of tonight's journey, we'll explore the final years of Frank Osman's life, how later generations viewed his remarkable experiences, and why stories of survival continue captivating audiences long after the events themselves have passed into history. Because eventually, every witness grows old. But some stories remain determined to keep sailing forward. There comes a moment in every generation when people begin to realize that their witnesses are disappearing. Not all at once, not dramatically, just gradually. A familiar name appears in a newspaper obituary. Then another. Then another. And before long, an entire generation begins slipping quietly into history. By the early years of the 21st century, this was happening to the survivors of the Titanic. The children who had once climbed aboard with parents and siblings were now elderly. The adults who remembered that cold April night were becoming increasingly rare. Every passing year reduced their numbers. Every passing year made their stories more precious. Frank Osman belonged to this shrinking group. A man who had not only survived one of history's most famous maritime disasters, but had somehow survived another major sinking decades later. His life increasingly felt like a bridge connecting different centuries. The world around him continued changing. Technology accelerated. Communication became instantaneous. Entire industries appeared and disappeared. The internet transformed daily life in ways that would have sounded like science fiction in 1912. Imagine explaining social media to a Titanic passenger. Millions of people voluntarily sharing photographs of breakfast. Entire arguments conducted through tiny glowing screens. Cats becoming internationally famous. One suspect's many Edwardian gentlemen would have required a very long lie down afterward. Frank witnessed this transformation firsthand. He experienced a world that moved from steamships to smartphones, from handwritten letters to instant messages, from horse-drawn vehicles still visible in some streets to spacecraft exploring distant planets. The scale of change is difficult to fully appreciate. Most people adapt gradually because they experience each development as it arrives. But when we look backward across a long life, the transformation becomes astonishing. Someone born in the early 20th century could genuinely claim to have witnessed one of the most dramatic periods of technological advancement in human history. And Frank was among them. Yet despite all these changes, people continued asking about the Titanic. That remained constant. Decades passed. Governments changed. Wars came and went. Entire generations were born. Still the questions returned. What was it like? What happened? What did you remember? The fascination never entirely disappeared. Perhaps because the Titanic represents more than a ship. It represents a moment, a snapshot of human ambition colliding with reality. The story contains elements people find endlessly compelling: hope, fear, confidence, tragedy, survival, loss. The ingredients remain powerful even after a century. Frank's personal connection to that story made him valuable to historians and researchers. Not because he possessed secret information. Most survivors did not. Disasters are often confusing while they occur. Few people see the entire picture. What survivors provide is something different. Atmosphere, emotion, perspective, the texture of lived experience. Historians treasure such things. Facts explain events. Memories explain people. And people are ultimately what history is about. As survivor numbers dwindled, public interest occasionally intensified. There is a curious urgency that emerges whenever a generation nears its end. People suddenly realize that opportunities are disappearing. Questions that could have been asked decades earlier become important. Interviews become more valuable. Archives become more precious. Memory becomes something to preserve rather than merely enjoy. This process repeated itself with Titanic survivors. Researchers hurried to collect testimony. Museums expanded exhibitions. Documentaries recorded interviews. Everyone understood the same reality. Soon there would be no living witnesses left. Only records. Only history. The transition carries a certain sadness. Human beings naturally value direct connection. Reading about an event is one experience. Speaking with someone who actually lived through it is another entirely. The second feels immediate, personal, real. Once that possibility disappears, something irreplaceable vanishes with it. The information may survive. The presence does not. Frank lived long enough to become part of that transition. A witness gradually becoming a historical figure. A participant slowly becoming part of the narrative itself. It is a strange transformation. Most people never think about it. They assume history belongs to other people. Ancient kings, military leaders, inventors, politicians. Yet ordinary individuals sometimes find themselves pulled into history through circumstance. Frank never set out to become significant. He boarded ships, lived his life, survived extraordinary events. The significance arrived afterward. History often works this way. Importance is frequently assigned in retrospect. The people involved rarely recognize it at the time. Meanwhile, public fascination with survival stories remained strong. Not just Titanic stories. All survival stories. There seems to be something deeply human about them. Perhaps because they reveal qualities we admire: courage, endurance, adaptability, luck. Sometimes all four simultaneously. Frank's story certainly contains each of those elements. Survival requires luck. Almost always. No matter how skilled or determined someone may be, circumstances matter. Being in the right place. Avoiding the wrong place. Receiving help at the right moment. Chance plays a larger role in history than many people like to admit. Frank understood this better than most. After all, surviving one major maritime disaster might be considered fortunate. Surviving two begins to feel almost statistically mischievous. The universe occasionally displays a peculiar sense of humor. As age advanced, Frank became not merely a survivor but a symbol of survival itself. A living reminder that extraordinary experiences can emerge from ordinary lives. One does not need to be a king, a general, or a famous explorer. Sometimes history selects a random passenger and hands them an unbelievable story, then spends the next century making sure people remember it. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Frank's life is its accidental nature. Nothing appears planned. Nothing appears intentional. He did not seek danger. He did not pursue fame. He simply happened to occupy certain places at certain moments. And those moments happened to become historic. There is something comforting about that reality. History often feels dominated by powerful individuals making grand decisions. Yet stories like Frank's remind us that ordinary people remain central to the human experience. Most history happens to people rather than because of them. And sometimes those people survive long enough to tell us about it. As the years moved quietly onward, Frank's generation continued fading. The voices became fewer. The memories became rarer. But the stories endured, preserved through interviews, books, archives, and the endless curiosity of people who wanted to understand the past. Because ultimately that curiosity never disappears. Humans are storytellers. We inherit stories, retell them, preserve them, pass them forward. One generation speaks. Another listens. Then eventually, the listeners become speakers. The cycle continues. Frank's story joined that cycle long ago. A boy survives the Titanic. A man survives the Empress of Britain. An old man becomes a witness to history itself. By the final years of Frank Osman's life, the world had become almost unrecognizable compared to the one he entered as a child. The steamship era had faded. Ocean liners no longer ruled long-distance travel. The Atlantic crossing that once required days aboard massive ships could now be completed in hours through the air. The age that produced the Titanic had become history. Yet somehow, the Titanic itself remained remarkably alive in public memory. And so did the stories of those who survived it. Frank's life had become one of those stories. Not because he sought fame, not because he wrote grand memoirs or toured the world giving speeches. His story endured because it contained something rare. A connection between ordinary life and extraordinary history. A child boarding a ship with his family. A frightened survivor rescued from the Atlantic. A man decades later finding himself aboard another doomed vessel. And finally, an elderly witness watching the world continue to rediscover events he had personally experienced. There is a quiet irony in that progression. When the Titanic sank in 1912, nobody aboard could have imagined that future generations would still be discussing it more than a century later. For the passengers, it was simply their present. For us, it is history. The same transformation eventually happens to every era. Today's headlines become tomorrow's archives. Tomorrow's archives become next century's documentaries. History is constantly moving forward, carrying human experiences with it. Frank lived long enough to see that process in action. He watched his childhood become a historical subject. He watched researchers analyze events he remembered personally. He watched films recreate moments that had once been terrifyingly real. Imagine the strangeness of that experience. Imagine seeing actors portray an event from your own memory. Imagine hearing audiences discuss details that, for you, were not scenes but sensations. The cold air. The confusion. The uncertainty. History often smooths rough edges. Memory rarely does. As survivor numbers declined, each remaining witness became increasingly significant. People recognized that an era was ending. Once the last survivor passed away, the Titanic would no longer exist within living memory. It would belong entirely to history. This realization created a sense of urgency. Interviews were recorded. Archives expanded. Researchers gathered testimonies. Society was trying to preserve voices before they disappeared. Frank's experiences became part of that preservation. Not because he was a celebrity, but because he represented a direct connection to the past. A bridge between modern audiences and a world that had vanished long ago. And what a world it was! A world of steamships and telegraphs. A world before commercial aviation transformed travel. A world before television entered living rooms. A world before the internet made information nearly instantaneous. Frank witnessed all of those changes. His lifetime stretched across one of the most transformative periods in human history. Few generations have experienced such dramatic shifts. Yet despite all the technological progress, the themes within his story remained surprisingly timeless. Survival, chance, memory, resilience. These are not modern themes or ancient themes. They are human themes. Perhaps that is why his story continues to resonate. The ships are historical. The emotions are not. Anyone can understand fear. Anyone can understand relief. Anyone can understand the strange experience of looking back on a life and realizing how much depended on moments that seemed ordinary at the time. A ticket purchased. A voyage begun. A lifeboat reached. Small decisions. Enormous consequences. History is often built from such combinations. We tend to imagine the past as a sequence of grand events directed by powerful individuals. In reality, much of history unfolds through ordinary people navigating circumstances they never expected to face. Frank Osman was one of those people. He did not command armies. He did not shape national policy. He did not invent new technologies. He simply lived through extraordinary moments and survived them. And sometimes that is enough to secure a place in history. As he entered the final stage of his life, Frank became less a participant in events and more a custodian of memory. He carried stories that fewer and fewer people could tell firsthand. With each passing year, his perspective became more unusual. The world he remembered was disappearing into books and museums. Yet through his memories, it remained briefly accessible. There is something deeply moving about that idea. A single human life preserving a connection to another era. Not perfectly. Memory never works perfectly. But sufficiently. Sufficiently to remind future generations that history was once the present for someone. That the people we study were real. That they worried about ordinary things. That they laughed, argued, hoped, and feared just as we do. Frank's story accomplishes this beautifully. The Titanic can sometimes feel remote because it has become so famous. Fame creates distance. We think of headlines, photographs, and documentaries. But through the life of one survivor, the disaster becomes personal again. A child, a family, a journey, a night of confusion and fear, a rescue, and then a lifetime spent carrying the memory forward. The same is true of the Empress of Britain. For most people, it is a historical footnote. For Frank, it was another lived experience. Another chapter in a life unexpectedly intertwined with maritime history. Together, the two disasters created a story almost too remarkable to invent, which is precisely why it continues to be told. As we drift toward the final part of tonight's journey, imagine Frank looking back across the decades. The decks of the Titanic fading into memory. The wartime Atlantic aboard the Empress of Britain. The long years afterward. The changing world. The growing realization that his experiences had become part of history itself. A life connected by water, chance, and survival. Eventually, every story reaches a shoreline. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just gradually. The years accumulate. The seasons pass. The faces around us change. And before long, what once felt like the present begins slipping gently into memory. For Frank Osman, that process unfolded across a remarkably long and unusual life. A life that began in one world and ended in another. When he was born, vast steamships represented the pinnacle of human travel. The Atlantic crossing remained a significant undertaking. News traveled at the speed of ships, trains, and telegraph wires. Entire nations measured distance differently because the world itself moved more slowly. By the end of his life, aircraft crossed oceans routinely. Information traveled instantly. Computers fit inside pockets. Human beings had walked on the moon. The transformation was extraordinary. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of Frank's life was not the technology he witnessed. It was the history he carried. Two major maritime disasters. Two miraculous survivals. One lifetime. The odds remained difficult to comprehend. And yet there he was. Living proof that reality occasionally produces stories more surprising than fiction. As historians reflected upon lives like Frank's, they often noticed something interesting. Survivors rarely describe themselves as heroes. That title is usually applied by others. Most survivors simply describe circumstances, decisions, moments, luck. The public often searches for grand explanations. The individuals involved frequently remember smaller details: a sound, a face, a conversation, a feeling. Memory tends to work that way. It preserves fragments. The larger meaning usually arrives later. Frank's story gained meaning gradually. At first it was merely survival. Then it became an unusual coincidence. Then it became history. And eventually it became a reminder of how unpredictable human lives can be. Because no reasonable observer looking at a young boy boarding the Titanic in 1912 would have predicted what followed. Nobody could. The future keeps its secrets remarkably well. That uncertainty is one of history's most enduring lessons. People in the past never knew how their stories would end. They worried about ordinary concerns, made plans, bought tickets, packed luggage, expected routine journeys. Then history intervened, sometimes gently, sometimes catastrophically. The Titanic certainly belonged to the second category. Yet even after that disaster, Frank's life continued, which may be the most important lesson of all. History often focuses on dramatic moments: the sinking, the rescue, the headline. But human lives consist mostly of everything that happens afterward. The years, The decades, the ordinary mornings that follow extraordinary nights. Frank survived the Titanic. Then he lived. He survived the Empress of Britain. Then he lived some more. The disasters occupy only a small percentage of his lifespan. The rest was spent doing what people always do. Moving forward, adapting, continuing. There is something quietly comforting about that. History loves dramatic events. Life generally prefers routine, and routine usually wins. Even the most extraordinary experiences eventually become memories carried into ordinary days. Perhaps this explains why survivor stories remain so compelling. They are not merely stories about danger. They are stories about continuation, about what happens next, about human beings refusing to allow a single event, however significant, to define an entire existence. Frank's story contains another lesson as well. A lesson about memory. Not personal memory. Collective memory. The memory societies choose to preserve. More than a century has passed since the Titanic sank. Yet people still remember. They still read. Still watch documentaries. Still visit museums. Still ask questions. The passengers themselves are gone. The ship rests on the ocean floor. But the story continues. That continuity matters. History survives because people remain curious. Because each generation inherits stories from the one before it, then passes them onward. The process is surprisingly fragile and surprisingly powerful. Without memory, history disappears. With memory, it travels across centuries. Frank became part of that process. A witness whose experiences helped connect different generations. People who never saw the Titanic learned about it partly through individuals like him. Not because he intended to become a historical figure, but because history occasionally selects ordinary people for extraordinary roles. And sometimes the role arrives entirely by accident. As evening grows quieter around us, imagine the full arc of Frank Osman's life. A child boarding an ocean liner. A survivor climbing into safety. A man decades later finding himself aboard another doomed vessel. A witness watching the 20th century unfold. An elderly observer seeing his childhood transformed into history. The journey feels almost impossible when viewed all at once. Yet it happened. One day at a time. 1 year at a time. Just like every other life. Perhaps that is the most reassuring aspect of history. Even the most extraordinary stories are lived in ordinary increments. Nobody experiences their life as a documentary. Nobody hears dramatic music before important moments. People simply wake up each morning and continue forward. Only later does history reveal which moments mattered. Frank never knew that future generations would discuss his experiences. He never knew that historians would preserve his story. He never knew that people decades later would remain fascinated by the strange coincidence of surviving two famous ship disasters. The future remained hidden, as it always does. And maybe that uncertainty is not something to fear. Maybe it is part of what makes human life so endlessly interesting. Because somewhere tonight, someone is living through a moment that future generations may one day find remarkable. Neither they nor we can know which moment it is. History rarely provides advance notice. It simply unfolds quietly, patiently, one life at a time. And so, as our story drifts toward its conclusion, let the Atlantic grow calm once more. Let the great ships fade into the distance. Let the decades pass like slow-moving waves beneath a moonlit sky. And remember Frank Osman, the boy who survived the Titanic, the man who survived another sinking nearly 30 years later. A witness to disasters, to change, and to history itself. Because long after the ships disappeared beneath the water, his story kept sailing. And in the end, perhaps that is what history truly is. Not ships, not icebergs, not headlines, but stories, quiet stories, carried forward from one generation to the next, waiting for someone to listen.